Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
When I was a kid, I loved The X-Files. I watched it right from the beginning with my mom. We watched every single episode as it was released. I was like 12 years old, and yes, my mom was a maniac for letting me watch stuff like that when I was only 12 years old, but still, I loved it. It didn't end very well. The last season or so could probably be skipped and it would still be a fine show, but still, I think it's great to this day. And there's talk of a reboot, so I'm very, very hopeful for that. So I was very excited for the X-Files board game from IDW and Pandasaurus, publishing partners. In this game, if you're not familiar with the overarching story of the X-Files, it's all about a division of the FBI that most people kind of see as a joke called the X-Files that looks into unexplained phenomena around the country. And Mulder and Scully are the two main agents of the X-Files. It's mainly Mulder, and then Scully, who has a sort of scientific reasoning, analytical mind, trying to keep him in check. And they're trying to get to the bottom of all these different cases around the country, while at the same time they start discovering clues of this overarching conspiracy by this sinister organization that's called the Syndicate. In this game, it's one versus all. So one player takes control of the cigarette smoking man, who was a recurring character in the show, who was sort of the field agent for the Syndicate, who went out and tried to conceal evidence of the Syndicate's involvement in all these different cases. And the other players at the table, up to 4 of them, are going to be the agents of the X-Files trying to work against the Syndicate. So you have Mulder, Scully, their director, Skinner, and Krychek, who, it's a bit of a reach to say that he's working with the agents, if you've ever watched the show, but still, they used what they could. So you're working together to stop the Syndicate player, and by solving all these different X-Files and bringing the Syndicate to light, the Syndicate player is trying to conceal as much evidence as possible and get the X-Files shut down. Let's go ahead and take a brief look at how the game is played, then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Okay, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the X-Files board game. This is a competitive one versus all game. Up to 4 of the players in the game are going to be the agents of the X-Files. One player is going to be the cigarette smoking man working for the Syndicate. The Syndicate is trying to conceal evidence of the alien conspiracy from the X-Files agents, enough that he actually is able to close the X-Files down from the FBI. The other agents are working to uncover this conspiracy and therefore shut down the Syndicate, and they will win the game if that's the case. Now, mechanically speaking, what they're trying to do, you have 2 trackers over here that indicate the progress of the Syndicate and the agents. Every time the agents are able to shut down an X-File, they get to draw evidence tokens from this bag. These evidence tokens have little magnifying glasses, sort of a la Arkham or Eldritch Horror, and they have numbers either 1 or 2 on the back. For an amount of investigative points equal to the number of agents that are in the game, they're able to spend that many points and build a part of this poster. This is the iconic poster that Mulder has hanging in his office, and this is just like the sort of the thematic representation of the agents working together to win the game. As soon as you have, every time that you get enough investigative points, you're able to build a part of this poster, and as soon as you've built the entire thing, and therefore moving this track down, you'll win the game. The Syndicate player, the cigarette smoking man, wants to conceal evidence, and what's going to happen is during his turn, he's going to be able to draw evidence tokens from this bag and put them behind his screen and count them as points, and every time that he does that, he also puts these cigarette tokens into the bag, therefore making it less likely that the agent players are going to be able to draw the evidence tokens they need. And as he continues to collect the evidence tokens, he'll keep track of his status here, but only to a certain degree. So 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. So the agents know approximately how well the Syndicate is doing. But as soon as the Syndicate player gets to 25 points worth of investigation tokens behind his screen, he is the winner. Now, every agent player at the beginning of the game is going to get their FBI credentials, proving that they are one of the main characters of the X-Files show. So you have Mulder. Let me just scoot in there a bit. So actually, here you go. There's Scully. There's Mulder. There's Alex Krycek, which seems kind of weird that he's an ally. And then there's Walter Skinner, who's the director of the X-Files. And they all have special abilities, too, and strengths and weaknesses. So Alex Krycek is really good at combat, and they're all good at strong in general investigations. But Alex Krycek is strong in combat, but he's also a double agent. He can hurt the other agents in order to get more investigative points, and he's weak in political maneuvering. Fox Mulder is strong in the paranormal, but he's weak in science. And Dana Scully is strong in science but weak in conflict. Walter Skinner is strong in political maneuverings but weak in the paranormal. And they have special abilities. So for instance, Fox is the believer ability. He gets to check out syndicate cards and peek at what they are in order to know what's coming up. Dana's skeptic ability lets her essentially draw more tokens and filter out the bad ones from the bag. So everyone's going to get their credentials. They'll also start with these agent cards. The agent cards are the cards which you're going to use to actually investigate the X-Files on the map. So they're usually going to be keyed into a specific type of investigation. Recuperate here says Recuperate says you get to heal an agent in your region, even yourselves of all wounds. Exhume Body says that you investigate 3 plus 1 for every influence that you spend. And this is an ally. Allies go into the ally space on the board, and then each time an agent suffers 1 or more wounds, they get to draw a card. Allies sort of stay in play and help you out. So just a real brief overview of the agent cards. Now, the cigarette smoking man is going to get this super cool DM screen, which he uses to conceal the amount of cigarette tokens he has and the evidence tokens that he's collected, as well as the syndicate cards that he has. He's going to start the game drawing syndicate cards as well, and the syndicate cards are what he's going to use to foil the investigations of the other players as they proceed through their investigations. So if we take a look at a few of them, you've got cards like Arson, which are going to cancel a paranormal investigation, or Injured, which wounds an agent, or Missing 9 Minutes, which lets you drain the influence tokens of players in a particular region, or Corrupt Law Enforcement, which will cancel a conflict investigation, or Hiding the Truth, which does absolutely nothing, but you can use it as a bluff in order to bluff out the other players. Now, the number in red is the number of influence you have to spend in order to pop the card, but playing them down to the board is actually free. And for the agent cards, I forgot to mention this, they have to spend a number of influence equal to 1 if it's a card that they're not strong or weak in, 0 if it's a card they're strong in, and 2 if it's a card that they're weak in. So at the start of the game, you have a little bit of board setup to do. You have these X-Files cases, which are going to have a number of them equal to the number of players. So that's actually 1 too many, and the number of agent players. So here's an example of what they are. You have the 4 different regions: the South, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West. And these are going to have a little bit of flavor text, all keyed into certain episodes of the show. And then down at the bottom, it's going to have the number of progress tokens from investigating that have to be put on this card in order for the card to pop and for the agents to be able to draw this many tokens from the bag and hope that they don't draw the cigarette tokens. They usually also have some sort of special thing that happens when you proceed with the investigation. So this one says, conflict investigations add 1 more progress to this X-file than usual. And sometimes it's bad, like any agent who proceeds with this investigation takes a wound, things like that. Lastly, for setup, the syndicate player, the cigarette smoking man, gets to play his syndicate cards down on any spots next to the areas where an X-Files investigation is ongoing. Now, once they're placed down like that, he's not really allowed to just freely pick them up, but during his turn, he's allowed to spend an influence token to swap them out with cards from his hand. Play always begins with the agents, and the agent's turn is very simple. The first thing that they can do is either move to an adjacent region, which is always just going to be 1 move unless you're trying to get all the way from the northeast to the west, in which case you'll have to move on 2 separate turns. But you get to move or stay in the region where you're at and trade a card with another player that's in your spot. Now, because the agents are cooperating, you're freely allowed to show each other your hands and discuss what's in your hands, but you probably don't want to say too much because the syndicate player is always listening. The second thing that you do is that you either grab a bunch of influence, 3 influence tokens to be precise, these being influence tokens over here, which you need to fuel your cards, and also potentially your special abilities, like Mulder's ability requires that you spend an influence token, or you can choose to actually use one of your agent cards by spending the appropriate amount of influence if necessary, and then proceeding to use it on the region that you're at, which usually initiates an investigation. If it's a card that is an investigation and it tells you to put a number of progress tokens out, you'll actually drop those onto the card that is in the region that you're at, the X-Files card. Now, at this point, when an investigation is started, and only then, the Syndicate player has the option of spending influence to pop the cards that are there. So if I had done this injured card by spending 1 influence from behind my screen, then the agent who's proceeding with the investigation has to take a wound. If it had been over in this region, let's say that Skinner was over here in the Midwest, and I wanted to activate this missing 9 minutes, I get to spend as much influence as I want, and every agent there loses that amount of influence. The corrupt law enforcement would cancel that investigation if it was a conflict investigation. So every player is going to be doing this, either working together or spreading around the map on their own and trying to solve all of these different X-Files cases by playing investigation cards and putting progress tokens on them until they pop, and then they get to draw evidence tokens from the bag. Once every agent player has gone in clockwise order, then the Syndicate player gets to go. And on the Syndicate player's turn, the first thing that he gets to do is draw evidence tokens from the bag, like I mentioned earlier. You draw an evidence token for every unsolved unclosed X-file that's still on the map. If the agents had been able to close one, in addition to drawing, they would put it face down here so that they consider it closed, and the Syndicate player would draw less tokens, and then during the Syndicate player's turn, he would reset the X-Files with new ones. But if, let's say that all 4 of those were still unclosed by the time the Syndicate player's turn comes around, then I would draw that many tokens from the bag, ignoring and disregarding cigarette tokens that are already in there, and those not counting against my draws, and then putting as many evidence tokens as I draw secretly behind my screen, and keeping track over there if I pass a certain thresholds of points. Then as long as the entire bag is not full of cigarette tokens, essentially, I put another cigarette token into the bag, and then play proceeds. Then I replenish any X-Files that were already actually solved before, refill my hand, take influence equal to the number of agents that I'm fighting against, and then proceed to put more Syndicate cards out on the board, remembering that I can't just take cards freely off the board that I'd already placed there, but I can spend an influence just to take a card back off the board and then swap it with one from my hands and put that card back down. Or I could even just take a card off the board and then secretly put the exact same card back down in the same spot just to bluff out the other players. And that's really it. You're going to continue to do this. The agents taking their turns trying to solve the X-Files. The Syndicate player trying to make that much more difficult by playing the Syndicate cards and flooding the bag with cigarette tokens. The Syndicate player wants to grab as many evidence tokens as possible until he gets to the magic number of 25. The agent players want to get enough evidence tokens to purchase the individual pieces of the I Want to Believe poster, which will signify that they have finally shut down the Syndicate somehow. That's essentially X-Files, the board game. Now, let's get to my final thoughts.
Component-wise, I think that X-Files is fairly solid. I like the artwork and the design. I'm pretty sure on this, they reuse all of the artwork on the cards, and the very beautiful illustrations on the box and in the instruction booklet, those are all from the comic book series that IDW had published. I'm not sure if they're still publishing it, if they had in the past, but whether they reuse it or not, it looks great, and the graphic design looks good. I like the map and the board. Sometimes it's a little unclear where regions begin and start other than the color coding, but it doesn't really need to be. There's really only 4 places you can be on the board, so it doesn't need to be too complicated, and everything seems fine. The rulebook is fairly well written out. I mean, it's a very, very simple game. I'll get back to that in a second, so that's fine. As far as I don't like the tokens that much, but they're really small and they're hard to tell apart in the beginning, but that's fine, whatever. As far as the theme goes, it's actually one of the big problems I have with this game, and that's that I don't know what I was necessarily expecting, but you don't really feel like you're part of the show in any sort of way. This is just move around, play a card, put tokens out. Cigarette Smoking Man is just trying to take tokens out of the bag and put tokens in. I didn't get any kind of sense of the theme of the show, of like this overarching conspiracy and the mystery and monsters. I didn't even bother to put artwork for any of the monsters on the investigation cards. It's just more pictures of the board and then a quote from the show, which I played with people who had never watched the show before. Well, one group was with people who had watched it like I did, another group was with people who hadn't watched it. Now, I will say that after playing the game, they did want to watch the show and find out more about it, but it wasn't really helping the fact that all these quotes taken out of context meant nothing and just seemed very silly. So it's weird. I think there was a lot of artistic choices and things that they could have done to sort of fluff out the context of the game with the with the original series world, and they just kind of missed that opportunity there. It felt rushed in that regard because I never really felt connected to the show. So that's a big problem with the game. As far as the mechanics of it and how the game works and how it plays from turn to turn, it's not a bad game, and there's nothing broken here. It does what it's supposed to do, but it's very simple. It almost has to be. It's a licensed tie-in. You want to drag in people who like the X-Files. Maybe they're not into board games so much, but they're like, wow, X-Files board game. I'm there. Okay. So you have to make it simple for those type of players, and it should be for casual gamers, and I get that. And it's relatively quick. If you play with more players, at the maximum player count of 5, it can drag on a bit, but it's not too bad. So that's fine. I like that it's accessible, but man, there's not a lot of decision-making to be had here, especially for the Syndicate player. The Syndicate player doesn't have too much to do in this game, especially if you're stuck with a bum hand of Syndicate cards. So you, if you didn't see the overview, you put out cards, the Syndicate cards, on each of the spots where there's an open X file. It's playing them as free, but then at a certain point you use your influence when they're about to investigate in order to pop the card and hope that it stimmies them in some way, shape, or form. But there's two problems with that. First is that you can't just pop a card whenever you want to. It has to be when they're doing an investigation by playing a card, and only then. They could, as far as I can tell, they can play another type of card, one of their agent cards, and it might be something incredibly beneficial for them that you would love to screw over, but you can't because they didn't actually investigate. They have to start an investigation in order for you to pop a card, even if the card is just they lose influence, which you might love to do, but you can't. So that's a little frustrating. And sometimes whatever cards you put there is just not going to function at all for the whole duration of the investigation, because some of the Syndicate cards are cancel an investigation, but they are keyed to a specific type of investigation. And if that never happens on that spot before the X-Files card is closed, it just sits there like a lump. It did nothing for you. That is frustrating. And you have to spend an influence just to swap out a Syndicate card. And that's frustrating too. Now, having said that, I think this game is weighted heavily in favor of the Syndicate. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, the Syndicate player gets screwed over. It's not really like that. It's just not interesting. And there's not a lot to do. Draw some tokens, put a cigarette token in, redraw your hand, put out as many cards as you can, because why not? And hope that you can actually use them. That's it for the Syndicate player. For the agents, it's move, play a card, or trade a card, and then try to play a card, and hope that you're not screwed over by the Syndicate card, which most times you're not. And then hope that when you draw tokens from the bag, they're the good tokens and not the cigarette tokens, which is, again, completely random. And even if that's the case, well, there's not much you can do about it. So you just go on to the next X-Files and hope that you draw better next time. So it's really, really very simple. There's not a lot going on either side. There's not a lot of critical thinking. There's not a lot of strategizing like, okay, you go here, I'll do this. There is some, you can show each other your hands and you can trade cards accordingly, but still, what you have to do is very, very obvious, and it's planned out, and just go here, play the best card you can to put as many tokens as possible. That's it. That's a bit weird and frustrating. It's frustrating that there's not more meat here. And when you get to like the midway point of the game, it feels like the game's on autopilot to a certain degree. So while I appreciate the accessibility of the game and its simplicity, its ease of learning, and the design and what it looks like, and having the cool cigarette smoking man screen and all of these different things, the concept is great. It really doesn't feel like that much of a game. It feels more like just going through the motions, and that's pretty disappointing. So I don't think it's broken. I don't think it's horrible. But if you're a fan of the show, you have to really be a fan of the show. I think you'll be, in fact, if you're as much of a fan as me, I think that you'll be disappointed that there isn't more of that theme coming out through the game. If you don't care about the show and you're just so, and you care about the gameplay, like you really couldn't care less about that. You just want to, maybe you like one versus all games, or you like games about moving and putting tokens on things, then I really wouldn't recommend this, because there's not enough meat here. There's just not enough game to sink your teeth into, if I could keep going with that metaphor. So it's a big disappointment for me, even though it's not terrible, and I hope that future licensed properties that IDW and Pandasaurus put out integrate the theme better and have more game there for people to get into.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.